Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there, retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barr.
And that makes this The Life of X. Bruce Lee, Part 4. I gotta be honest with you, Melvin. Did not think this was gonna go 4 episodes.
I did not either. This is a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, I feel good. I feel good about it. I'm a little tired, but we're trucking through this.
Yeah, in case you guys haven't noticed, we've been locked in a room with each other for about 4 hours today. Longer than that, 7 hours now. Jeez.
Yeah, I know. Before we jump back into Bruce, real quick, where last we left off, Bruce had become a star in Hong Kong. He was gaining some notoriety in the U.S. for his role in Longstreet, and so that's what we're going to pick up there. But we noticed at least one mistake. I'm sure there's probably more than one that we haven't noticed. But in, I believe,
episode
one or two, one of the early episodes when we talked about Bruce meeting Linda Lee, who became his wife, we misspoke about her name, which was Linda Emery, not
Linda Lee. Not Linda Cadwell.
Yeah,
that's a later development. And, if she ever listens to this pod, we apologize for getting that wrong. And, but, we're too stubborn to go back and re-record anything.
Yeah, I mean, currently I'm running our sound, and I'd probably end up deleting the whole episode.
He's a horrible tech.
If we tried to do that.
So,
let us get right back down to Bruce.
All right. So, if you guys remember, Bruce had signed on to a 2-film deal. The first film that they produced was The Big Boss. Turned out to be a smash hit in Hong Kong. Produced 3 million Hong Kong dollars, which was huge at the time. And, things are kind of starting to look up for Bruce. Linda, who had been working a job to help make ends meet, which was, this was crushing Bruce, was finally able to quit her job and go back to, taking care of the kids and, managing the family. So things are looking up, and Bruce is getting ready to film his second film, which is titled
Fist of Fury.
Or The Chinese Connection. For me growing up, I always knew the film as The Chinese Connection.
Yeah, and that's one thing that was kind of confusing in reading this book is that, when they were released in the U.S., they got different names. And so I was like, which one is this again?
But Big Boss was Big Boss in the U.S., wasn't it?
Yes, I think so.
I mean, I always knew it as Big Boss, so I'm assuming it was, but Yeah, Fist of Fury or Chinese Connection. If you have seen the movie, know when we say Fist of Fury or Chinese Connection, we're referring to the same film. I'll just give you guys a quick plot rundown. So Bruce in this movie plays the character Shenzhen, who is a student of the real-life person, Huo Yanjia. Huo lived in, I believe, up until the mid-1920s. And he was, a martial arts figure in China that was known for defeating the Japanese imperialists in a number of martial arts competitions. The plot of the film is that Hui Jia is killed in a match against a Japanese martial arts expert, which I think actually happened. And Bruce plays one of his students who comes back and realizes, like, oh my goodness, my master's been killed. And in this case, he's been murdered. So the Japanese in the film poison the master, and that's why he loses the martial arts competition. And Shenzhen, the guy that Bruce plays, is like, how can my healthy master die? And what happens is he finds out that the Japanese poisoned the master and then seeks revenge. And he defeats a number of Japanese martial artists and even one Westerner. I think the guy's supposed to be Russian.
It's important to note that this really was resonant with the audience in Hong Kong because the wounds were still fresh from, Japanese imperialism and that sort of thing. And there's one scene in particular where I believe, where's he walking to that he sees that sign?
I don't know where it's actually the film.
I just couldn't remember if it was a park or where it was, but he was walking into this park and there's a sign that reads "No dogs are Chinese," and Bruce's character jumps up and like kicks it down, which you can imagine theaters full of people going crazy.
Chinese patriots.
Yeah, going crazy when that happens.
So this is where, when we talk about Bruce Thomas's account of certain things, it gets a little bit iffy.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce obviously folded in these kind of patriotic elements into his film because he knew it would resonate with the audience. And as Arif points out, there is this famous sign that was supposed to have been in a park in Shanghai. But today, historians mostly agree this sign never existed. It was not a real sign, although if you read Bruce Thomas's account, he will say it was a real sign. Needless to say, that doesn't actually really matter.
It was the sentiment that mattered.
It was the sentiment. That was a very normal thing for the Japanese in their concessions to exclude Chinese from certain activities and going to certain places. So it was tapping in on that sentiment. And the idea, the fact that this type of a sign was kind of created and turned into this very important central myth about Japanese imperialism underscores kind of those feelings that were there. And basically in the film, Bruce goes through and defeats all of these Japanese specialists. And there's lots of things that nod to the Chinese audience that they just ate up. Like Bruce at one point disguises himself as a Japanese guy and as a telephone repairman. So, there's a lot going on with the film in terms of Chinese history. Now, the film also is directed by this guy, Lo Wei, who Bruce had worked with before on the previous film, but their relationship was strained even then. And it only gets worse as they record this film, and Bruce can barely stand to work with him because based on Thomas's account, he's just kind of unprofessional and just not very good at his job. And Bruce was sort of a perfectionist that was trying to work on this shoestring budget. But needless to say, they produce another successful movie, a great hit, and it goes on to make 4 million Hong Kong dollars, which eclipses the record that Big Boss had set. And Bruce becomes a major star in Hong Kong. And with that comes, some of the challenges of being a celebrity.
Like Melvin just said, at this point, I don't even know if celebrity is the right word for Bruce. He was like transcendent.
He was walking on water in Hong Kong.
Yeah. I mean, he was a national hero at that point, or at least in Hong Kong he was. When you get famous, you get a lot of attention, some of it unwanted. And, suddenly Bruce finds himself, in all the tabloids linked to every female film star there was, and rumors all over the place about Bruce Lee this and Bruce Lee that and all that stuff. But he had the wherewithal to navigate those waters, and he also took the opportunity to capitalize on his success to make a new deal with Raymond Chow. What they did was that they became partners and started Concord Productions, which would give Bruce a lot more creative control and more say in the matter of creating these films.
Yeah, and he was really interested in sharing in the profits from the films. And we recorded a podcast on Wilt Chamberlain, and I've decided to call this the Wilt effect, in that when he starts making all this money, now all of these other Hong Kong actors are like, whoa, Bruce is doing what? I want in on that.
Like, I'm not Bruce Lee, but I'm not that far off of Bruce Lee.
Right. So they start restructuring their contracts, and everybody starts making more money, and they start really changing how they're approaching film. So really, Bruce had this sort of ripple effect on the Hong Kong film industry and started to kind of open it up and give the actors themselves a lot more power. And, by this point in time, Bruce is doing good. He's feeling good, feeling great. And, that house that he'd been saddled with in LA, he finally sells it, man.
It's just been a money pit, like, since he bought it.
Yeah, and they were living in a pretty small, like, modest home in Hong Kong, but then they move into a bigger 2-story place that's pretty nice, but heck, he can afford it at this point in time. So he's got rid of the house, and he's a huge star, and it's time for him to make another film.
Yeah, so he starts writing the script for Way the Dragon, which is it contains my personal favorite scene. I don't know if it's my personal favorite Bruce Lee movie on the whole, but the climactic fight with Chuck Norris is definitely it's probably my favorite Bruce Lee fight scene.
So I'll give you a rundown of the plot again. Quick rundown of Way of the Dragon. Bruce, he ends up moving to Italy, and he leans on his life experiences moving to, Seattle in the United States, and he basically comes in to work for this Chinese restaurant that is being terrorized by these local thugs. And he ends up showing the guys how to fight, and he has to destroy all of these thugs that are coming in to harass the restaurant, because I think they actually wanted the restaurant as a part of, some like building plan or whatever they wanted to do. So the idea was harass these guys enough and they'll leave. Well, they didn't want to leave, and Bruce helps them defeat all of these thugs that are coming to bust up the restaurant. And after defeating all of his low-level thugs, they bring in a bunch of upper-level thugs from over the pond, and basically international toughs. This group of international toughs is headed by the one and only Chuck Norris. As
Walker,
said,
Texas Ranger.
As Eric said, at the time, Chuck was a karate champion and pretty well regarded in his own right, at least as a competition fighter. And they have this climactic fight scene that's illegally filmed at the Coliseum. The only spectator being a small kitten. It's a brilliant fight scene. It's really one of, probably one of Bruce's better fight scenes, and it illustrates some of his more, central points about his philosophy around fighting. They start off fighting this very rigid fight, and because they're fighting this very rigid fight, it is to the advantage of, in this film, Chuck is like a karate practitioner, and because it's rigid, Bruce is losing, and he decides that he's going to use this sort of broken rhythm. Now, the character that he's playing, I should mention, his name is Tang Long. And he starts to kind of dance around, almost like Muhammad Ali.
It looks a lot like Muhammad Ali.
And he uses the broken rhythm, but like with a little bit of rhythm, and ends up defeating this guy. And it shows this really deep respect for like the warrior ethos.
Yeah, because even in defeating Chuck Norris, he lays his body down and like puts his like gi jacket and his belt over his body and like showing him respect.
They fought to the death, and there was a point where Chuck's character is injured.
Yeah.
And it's like he knows that he's going to die, but he still keeps on fighting. And at the end of the day, like Bruce, Tang Long respects that.
Yeah. We talked about how Bruce's films really played to like Chinese nationalism and stuff. And this sort of is symbolic in that here is this Chinese man defeating this white man in the Coliseum, which is like the center of Western civilization. That was not an accident, I don't think.
Yeah, so, he's had 3 hits, all of which have played to the sentiments of the Chinese audience. And he's the man in Hong Kong, as we've mentioned.
We should also mention, too, that Way of the Dragon was Bruce's first foray into getting to produce and write.
And it was the first Hong Kong film that was filmed in Europe or something like that, which is crazy because, the budget was only $130,000. So the fact that they managed to fly all these people out and get it done is really remarkable. But, Bruce is a star in Hong Kong, and now he's really struggling with the reality of being famous. He can't go out to eat. If he does, then all the waiters are hanging around his table and people, crowds develop. But it's ultimately what he wanted. But his mother, in Thomas's account early on, warned him, like, listen, man, like, fame isn't all that it's cracked up to
be.
Because
when Bruce was having all those troubles with school and stuff, she was like, what are you going to do? And he's like, oh, I'll just be a film star. And she was like, their lives are not what they seem like. It's
right.
It's a hard life, and Bruce is finding out the hard way. And that home that he bought in Hong Kong, which was a beautiful house and that sort of thing, it really became like his refuge because he couldn't go out and not be harassed.
And there's stories about like he has to lock the doors in the house. Like he had a friend over, and the friend wanted to use the bathroom, and he had to open it with the key because he's like, we have to make sure the maids like don't take certain things, or the people who work on the house don't take certain things. So it became his refuge, but it also kind of became his like almost
prison.
Like a prison.
Yeah, and the level of fame too, like it's kind of hard for me to even like think about. Thomas mentions that he even had to have bodyguards for his kids because it was like legitimately a possibility that someone would kidnap his kids for ransom because of how famous and rich he was.
Yeah, so he's living in the new house that we talked about, and he purchased himself a new Mercedes because he loves cars.
That's right.
And he's a snazzy dresser, and he's struggling with being famous, and he just continues to do what he does, and that's make films. And he starts working on a film called The Game of Death.
And Bruce had planned, because filming Way of the Dragon, as awesome as it was exhausting.
Oh, yeah.
So the plan had been to take some time, just kind of recuperate, that sort of thing. And back in 1967, Bruce and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had met, and Kareem had wanted to be a student. And so they had got to know each other. Bruce showed him some stuff and all that. And Bruce had the idea for Game of Death and kind of thought about it in terms of like this tower of the main character fighting up against different people and more or less culminating in a fight with someone who doesn't have a defined style. And in his mind, it was going to be, Kareem. And he heard that Kareem was in Hong Kong, and he just snatched him up right away and was like, hey, we got to shoot a fight scene.
Yeah, the crazy thing is he shoots this scene, which is pretty iconic. I mean, you can go on YouTube and find it. I mean, it's the scene where he wears the famous yellow jumpsuit. I mean, he gets kind of kicked in the chest, and it has the footprint on his chest.
And it's crazy, too, to watch the disparity in height.
Literally like 2 feet between the two of them.
Yeah.
And he snatches up Kareem because he finds out he's in Hong Kong, and he's like, man, we gotta shoot this scene. Now, he knew enough about what he wanted to do to shoot the scene, but they hadn't even written the script.
Which wasn't that uncommon, apparently.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, in Hong Kong films that are produced, like a lot of it was produced on the fly. They didn't have this like firm script, and Bruce would just come up with stuff and make it work. And the crazy thing is, he records this brilliant martial arts scene with Kareem, and it wasn't even, he would spend hours scripting these fights, but to do it without a full idea of the movie and still be able to make it into something coherent was a skill that Bruce had. I mean, he also invited a friend from the United States, Taki Kimura, to take part in the film, and Kimura was a little bit hesitant to actually take part in the film, and he actually never really ends up coming out because as Bruce finally convinced him to like come out and help me create the film, play one of these characters, Linda ended up telling him like, hey, there's something else in the works, which we'll get to in a moment. But while Bruce was working on this film, he also gets sidetracked by his old buddy Unicorn, who calls him in kind of as a favor in 1972 to make a film called Unicorn's Palm or The Fist of the Unicorn or something like that.
Some other awesome title.
And the movie was basically, we're not going to go into detail about the film, but it was bad.
Yeah, and it was supposed to be Unicorn's breakout, and it really ended up just getting billed as another Bruce Lee film because they knew that people would go see it because it was Bruce Lee.
I think to some degree, it soured a little bit the relationship between Bruce and Unicorn. And Bruce was already, at this point in time, really kind of paranoid in that, like, old friends would show up and they were kind of there to just use him.
Yeah, Bruce was ready to burn some bridges.
Yeah, he was. I mean, especially when a lot of people are approaching him as their meal ticket.
Yeah.
So that really strained the relationship that he had.
Which is kind of ironic because like that's more or less what he was doing when he approached Steve McQueen.
Well, I think that was the reason why he was willing to do that kind of thing for Unicorn. But it was that when they went to do the film, Unicorn wasn't ready or prepared or professional about it, and that kind of really upset Bruce, especially considering he was kind of lending his name to the project. And there's all these other projects that are popping up at the time. Like they wanted Bruce to make a movie with Elvis Presley, which if you guys don't know, Elvis was practicing karate for a little while and a couple other things, but he was really not good.
No, and Bruce Thomas in the book kind of gives a quick accounting that both Elvis and Priscilla was his wife.
Yeah.
They both were practitioners of karate, and, Elvis had this quick ascendance where he was just, suddenly like a whatever degree black belt. And it also just happened to coincide with the fact that he was buying his instructors like $50,000 cars and stuff.
$50K every time. It was like, here's $50K. Let me get that black belt.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because Thomas points out that while they were just giving Elvis, who had become rotund by this point, this black belt, Priscilla was actually like legit, even though her ranking was much lower. She probably could have beat up her husband.
Oh yeah, dude. I mean, the idea of Elvis Presley and Bruce Lee being in a film. I mean, can you imagine Bruce Lee with his kind of anti-traditionalist approaches and looking at like Elvis Presley's going to show up rocking a black belt, like this black belt means that I am a skilled fighter.
Yeah, I just think it would have been like the old cartoon Johnny Bravo.
Oh my gosh. And I'm sure Bruce would have just like done something to just really scare the daylights out of
for sure.
Presley. So at this time, he's dealing with all this stuff, and there's these movie offers, and actually Warner Brothers kind of take a second look at Bruce. So we didn't really talk this up too much in the earlier episodes, but a big reason why Bruce was never given that breakout role was just the fact that it wasn't believed that a Chinese guy could carry a feature film in the U.S. Like, would audiences really buy into a Chinese star? Can they connect with that? And, one way that this plays out is he was actually trying to get a show earlier created that was called Kung Fu. And it's basically his brainchild.
Yeah.
He does all of the thinking about it, and he comes up with the conceptual idea. And people are like, yeah, this is a good idea.
But we should have a white guy be the main
Right.
guy.
We're going to kick you off of this, and we'll bring in David, I think, Carradine.
Carradine, I don't know.
Yeah, who obviously, I think, the show was still kind of getting reruns in the 90s when I was a young pup, and I'd seen a couple episodes. But it's hilarious to think that they dropped Bruce Lee, probably one of the most important martial artists in the world at the time, someone who actually practiced Kung Fu, for this guy who knew nothing about Kung Fu to start this show. So, and that rejection really hurt Bruce and drove him. But, fast forward to 1972, the early 1970s, and he's finally getting a little bit of respect.
Yeah. These people are beginning to put respect on his name.
Right. So Warner Bros. Realizes, hey, maybe we should give him another look. And this is in large part due to the head of Asian distribution at Warner Brothers named Richard Ma. He basically goes to the president and some of the higher executives, and he's like, listen, there's this guy, Bruce. We need to get on board to make him a film, because he's over here in Hong Kong blowing it up. And most of the executive members there were just like, I don't know, he's still kind of Chinese.
Those are very valid points, but he is Chinese, so probably not.
And luckily for Bruce, and luckily really for Warner Brothers, Ted Ashley, the president, is like, I like it. Let's give it a shot. They weren't all in, but they were now willing to throw some money behind Bruce, and he finds out about this. And what does he do? Man,
he finds every bridge that he's ever walked across, and he pours gasoline on it.
So he basically goes back, and he's like, listen, I told Coburn I was going to be bigger than him. And I told Steve McQueen I was going to be bigger than him. So he calls him up, and he's like, listen, I'm big now.
I'm very rich.
One of the negotiating sticking points that he had with Warner Brothers, because it didn't just jump off, it wasn't just like they called Bruce and Bruce jumped and was like, yes, I'm ready. There had to be negotiations that were done between Bruce and Raymond Chow and the executives over at Warner Brothers. And part of his stipulations was like, I need to be paid more than these guys. They acquiesce and they say, you know what, we'll pay you this much. And Raymond Chow was a little bit hesitant. He was like, I don't know if this is a good idea. But Bruce just looked at him and said, make the deal. And they agreed to shoot a film called Enter the Dragon. But before they do, something happens.
And I want to back up real quick, too, because in Burning These Bridges, he also, not necessarily to the same extent, but he also does the same thing with Sterling Silliphant, or at least kind of rubs his nose in his success. And that one kind of bugs me the most, because Silliphant, more than anyone, really had his back, it seems like, in the early days in terms of elevating him and making sure he wasn't starving. Again, nobody's perfect. And obviously, one of Bruce Lee's lesser traits can be that ego. Yeah,
and I think that's he went back and thought about The Silent Flute, right? The movie we talked about earlier. And the fact it was never made, but he went back and it was like, listen, if it's going to be made, it's going to be on my terms.
Yeah.
And he kind of, everybody that was involved with it before, he was just kind of saying I told you I was going to make it. And I needed you guys then, but I don't need you now. As a matter of fact, you need me.
Yeah, it's all well and good to use, doubters as your motivation.
Haters.
Yeah, the haters.
But the haters are my fuel.
But it's just a shame that in this case, the doubters he chose to use were also his friends.
I'm pretty sure he told Steve McQueen, he's just like, listen, man, why should I carry you on my back? He's like, I like you, but I'm not going to carry you. And he just took those words that McQueen had used earlier and just threw them back in his face.
He took those hinges
off the door.
And he put them in Steve McQueen's hands.
Khaled style.
But on a less light note, his good friend, James Lee, who had, if you recall, had really introduced Bruce to weightlifting and helped him develop his physique and his physical training, and also helped Bruce build these machines and different bars and equipment for him to train with. He had been suffering from the black lung, which was directly related to his profession as a welder.
I'd always associated it with mining.
I've literally only ever associated it with mining because of the movie Zoolander.
Oh, God, got the black lung pop.
Exactly. So I was surprised too that he got it from welding, but not because I have any sort of knowledge about the black lung.
Also, like, how many cases of black lung were there outside, mining country? So I mean, I did not realize that welding, black lung.
Yeah, I wonder if
came
like
hand in
this
hand.
was, whenever you see welders now, they're like wearing full like face masks and stuff. I wonder if like it has something to do with not wearing face masks and stuff.
Yeah,
like that.
I mean, but they still get it nowadays, don't they?
I don't know. Anyway, James, who, if you'll recall, was like a father figure to Bruce. After Bruce's biological father had passed away, like James really kind of like filled that role for him. They were extremely close and they kept in touch throughout Bruce's ascendance, and it really messed Bruce up emotionally.
And this is kind of, occurring at an important time where I think Bruce was starting to feel like his circle was kind of shrinking. The people that he could really trust, like people that he thought were his friends, that he now realized were like maybe trying to exploit him a little bit. I think he was still friends with people like Unicorn, but the relationship had kind of changed, and this is all obviously, of course, according to Bruce Thomas's account, but it seems like he was becoming a little more isolated as his fame grew.
It's lonely at the top.
Yeah, man. Not everybody can make it to the top of Everest. He gets the deal in 1972 for a crossover film, a Hollywood / kind of Hong Kong production, which they term Enter the Dragon.
My personal favorite Bruce Lee movie.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's
good.
It's a legendary film. It was produced for $500,000, a king's ransom in Hong Kong.
Back in the day.
Now the plot is you have the character Lee, very creative.
Yeah.
The character Lee, who's this martial artist, kind of training at in association with the Shaolin Temple, and he gets tapped to basically take part in an investigation of this, what they assume is this crime lord named Han, who has his private island where he holds these martial arts tournaments. Now, one thing that Bruce Lee always talked about was like he wasn't an idiot. He was like, listen, people have guns. And they're like, what would you do if a guy had a gun? And it's like, well,
I would die.
So to make the movie like a little more interesting and believable, they work around in the plot that Han has like a metal scanner on the island that will pick up any guns that are, on the island. So they need to send people in that are undercover that can take part in this martial arts tournament. And the film is shot in Hong Kong. It's like a half Hong Kong film crew and a half like U.S. film crew. And this creates enormous problems because not everybody speaks the same language and they have different, film traditions. One thing that Bruce Thomas points out in the biography, which is spot on, is that labor is cheap in Hong Kong. So if you need something like built, you don't spend a lot of money to do it. You just, because people's time and labor is cheaper than anything. So they have a small army of, carpenters and people building these sets, which a lot of the money was spent on building this like underground prison that is mostly made of mud.
Right. And I think at like one point, it's like Bruce punched through the wall or something like that in the film, and they had to like go back and like repatch it with more mud or something like that.
It was a wild wooden bars, like the bars that in the film they look like metal, but they're like actually just like some guys whittled that.
And another thing too is that today you can go be an extra in a movie or whatever, and they weren't necessarily paying for extras. There's scenes with these people who had been drugged and that sort of stuff, and they're being held captive, and like they didn't pay actors for that. They went and they paid prostitutes to play these women. They went and they found like homeless guys, and
dude, literally like a lot of the kids were like real street urchins.
Yeah.
And the fact that they had real prostitutes.
Yeah.
According to Bruce Thomas, I'm like, man.
Yeah.
Which he kind of has this like disparaging remark. He's like, well, at least they made money without having,
Yeah, no. Bruce Thomas has a certain view about sex workers. So you guys can read into that and find it yourself if you want to. I'm not going to repeat what he said.
Right.
And this was like, I'm sure it wasn't funny at the time, but it's kind of funny to think about now that there's a scene at the end where there's this like rush of people and they're fighting Han's men and stuff like that. But the actors, quote unquote actors, if you want to call them, like the extras, there was like different gangs who were embedded.
Oh, yeah.
There was actual gang fights happening among these extras while the film is rolling.
So basically the film, in terms of the actual production of the film, it was a masterpiece when it came out, but
for sure.
It was a train wreck as it was being recorded. So as Arifis alluded to, there were legit like different collections, according to Bruce Thomas, of like gang members, some of these guys, triads, and they just would like settle scores on the on set. And really the other major issue is like Bruce was, dude, he was like not happy with the shooting initially, and he actually didn't show up for the first
he was like, I'm out.
2 weeks of the filming, and some of these guys like showed up, chest puffed out. John Saxon rolled out thinking like, yo, he's the star of the show. And, Bruce kind of butted heads with him a little bit. And he also butted heads with the producer who went out of his way to like edit the script so that it was difficult for Bruce to produce some of these words.
Real jerk.
One of the names, which I always thought was really weird, even when I was a kid, the guy who hires Bruce to go to the island is like a British kind of, maybe like a MI5 or MI6 like agent. I don't remember what it is. His name is Mr. Braithwaite. And obviously, if you're not a native English speaker, and especially if you're coming from China, where sometimes certain R's or L's can be difficult to produce, that turns into a problem. So he knew it would be, and he wrote that into the script.
Yeah, and like he would just change words to make sure it was as difficult as possible for Bruce. It was just like a real jerk move.
Right. So basically, Lee and a couple of other characters end up on the island. We'd be remiss to not talk about some of the other characters in the film. So you have John Saxon, who plays an American character he's kind of this like Hollywood guy who basically has a bunch of gambling debts that he needs to pay back to the mob. His character's name is Roper. He's kind of the pretty boy. There's another character who's really iconic that's played by Jim Kelly named Williams. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is they actually had a different actor in mind for this role who they initially signed on, but he backs out kind of in the last moment, which is crazy because Jim Kelly's role as Williams is iconic. If you've ever seen Boondocks or anything, like if you were a black kid basically growing up in the States, like you saw Williams and you were like, yo, that's my guy. The afro, everything. And Williams, what's really cool about this is it also plays on some of the different like racial dynamics in the U.S. Williams ends up at the tournament because he does karate in the U.S. and he has a run-in with the police. So he has to escape from the U.S. and basically heads to Hong Kong. And these cops were like out to get him because they were like, man, this like black guy's not going to Hong Kong. It's somewhere near Hawaii. It's way too nice. So they just decide they're going to lock him up. So, I mean, if you're a black kid in the U.S. in the 70s, like watching this, you're like, yo, my man, like that's, I'm into that. So, those are what I'd say are the three major characters, and they fight in the tournament. And there's also Han, who is the main bad guy that I've mentioned already. He has a bodyguard who's this super muscular dude named Bolo. I think in real life we pretty much just refer to him as Bolo. And he's one of the main henchmen. And there's another guy named O'Hara that Bruce dispatches of midway through the film, and O'Hara was also responsible for murdering his sister in the film. And one thing that's interesting that happens with that fight is Bruce gets cut because they're shooting with real glass. Yeah,
we mentioned before that they didn't have the fake. I guess Thomas mentions that I guess broken glass type stuff in the U.S. would have been made out of like sugar. They would just like crumble.
Glass. Yeah, no sugar glass.
No, we had real glass.
If you got thrown through a window, it was a real window.
Okay, pause. The craziest thing though was that Bruce got bit by a cobra.
Oh yeah. He got bit by a cobra while shooting this.
Yeah, so there's a scene with a cobra, obviously, and Bruce, for the effect, wanted that hood out. And so he would like hit it in the face. Luckily, all of its venom had been drained beforehand, but one time the cobra decided it was sick of getting hit in the face, and so it bit Bruce.
Yeah.
Hey, honey, how was your day?
Bruce fine. In his fight
got bit by a cobra.
Bruce in his fight with O'Hara gets cut, and it's like this big. The stuntmen are really upset, and they think that the guy who's playing O'Hara did it on purpose. But eventually, they get over that. And Bruce tries to sneak into O'Hara's compound, and initially he has to kind of run away, and Han thinks that it's Williams. And Han ends up killing Williams, which, really hurt me as a child. And basically at the end of the day, it's left to Bruce and John Saxon, Roper and Lee to save the day. And they do. A big fight breaks out in the end because they release all of the toughs that had been locked up on Han's island, which apparently were actual, like, triads. When there's a big fight between them and the martial arts students that are on Han's island. And in the end, Lee defeats Han in this, iconic scene where there's the mirrors and he ends up like hitting him with a spear with like Han had a claw hand, by the way.
Well, that's what it said. Like, to me, like the iconic image from that movie is Bruce standing there with like the claw mark on his chest.
Yep. And they call in the reinforcements, and a bunch of soldiers fly in to help subdue everything. And really, the movie is a masterpiece. And I think probably all the listeners out there have seen it. And if you haven't, stop what you're doing.
Shame on you.
Shame on you. Go rent the movie, or, we all got Netflix. It might be on there.
I don't think it is, actually. I was looking.
Shame on Netflix.
Yeah, but just, hit it up on Amazon Video or whatever. I'm sure there's some way to buy it.
One other thing that's going on while all of this is taking place is like Bruce is dealing with a lot of stress. And by the time he actually goes to film this, his health is, he's a healthy guy, but it ain't all that it was cracked up to be. There's reports that Bruce had started to lose weight, and he had been complaining of headaches that had been, a major problem for him leading up to the film. And, in May of 1973, while dubbing the film, because remember, a lot of Hong Kong films, the audio is recorded afterwards. So they just go back and Bruce, meticulously worked to get the audio right.
And he's dubbing these films, he's in a recording studio, and it's not in a top-of-the-line, high-tech, climate-controlled recording studio like the one that Melvin and I record in. But he's in a very hot, like sweltering hot recording studio that had air conditioning, but the air conditioning had to be cut off because the sound was interfering with the recording. And so, he is already not feeling well. He's like totally dehydrated, and it just ends up being too much for Bruce, and he just passes out.
Yeah, he collapses. I think he started to feel faint. He may have even collapsed right there, but then he got up and went to the bathroom and collapsed again.
For 20 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, which is that's a long time, man. That's real bad. And who was it, just like a janitor or something?
Not anyone who knew him, but they go into the bathroom and there's passed out Bruce Lee.
They find Bruce and he's passed out, and this was bad. I didn't realize how bad it was. There was apparently some swelling in the brain, and they hit it pretty much like brain surgery.
To me, this is very significant, and we'll get into when Bruce dies and stuff. But at this point, they diagnosed that this was a problem, that he had fluid around the brain.
Yeah,
right now, and so this is kind of, it's obviously something that's going to recur.
Bruce Thomas talks about the fact that he had taken some pretty serious hits to the head.
Yeah, because Bruce did his own stunts.
Yeah, I think there was only 2 instances that he talks about where he did use a stunt double. But, with the fight scenes, a little bit of timing that's off and you get whacked in the face with a kick or a punch or a weapon. So he's dealing with these head injuries. And really, he's, according to Bruce Thomas, he's dealing with loneliness. His circle of friends had kind of shrunk, and really all of his really, really close friends, according to Thomas, were in the United States.
Yeah.
Those guys that he kind of started teaching martial arts to around college and things like that. So he's isolated from them, and he's not doing very well. And they flew back to California, went to UCLA to get his head looked at after they had stabilized him at the hospital in Hong Kong, which was crazy because it sounds like it was really serious, man.
Yeah.
He was in and out of consciousness for a long time, and they had to do some serious operations to him. But when he got to the U.S. and at UCLA, they were like, we can't really explain this. You're in fabulous health. He had been working extremely hard for an extremely long time, dealing with a great deal of stress and emotions, and it was weighing on him.
Yeah, and after he recovers from this, Thomas says that he starts to kind of show his dark side. That's something that Thomas had kind of talked about when we talked about the shadow in a previous episode, that Bruce had tussled with this dark side, and he said that following this collapse, that dark side starts to come out more. Bruce starts to drink more. Thomas doesn't ever actually say it, but he implies that he starts engaging in these extramarital affairs. He becomes extremely suspicious of everyone around him, and even begin experiencing some short-term memory loss, as well as the continued headaches.
Yeah, so we'd mentioned before, his health is kind of,
it's declining. He's been consistently losing weight and looking less and less healthy. And Thomas makes a point of pointing out that his skin tone was changing and becoming just more consistently pale. He just began to look sickly.
Yeah, I think that they talk about when he was shooting Enter the Dragon, he lost 10 pounds.
Yeah,
and
he wasn't a big dude.
That's like me losing 10 pounds, and
you'd be
not
weightless.
Yeah.
I
lost 10 pounds last time I was living in China.
You would be two-dimensional.
Yeah, bro, I would turn and be in a different dimension. You would not believe it.
What's
Blow
it like?
away when I go outside.
What's it like to fly?
I don't know. It's kind of nice. I got these lats.
Just a small burst of wind.
So we're talking about this declining health because we're contextualizing what happens in July of 1973, and that's Bruce Lee's death. One evening he's over at another actress in her home. Her name was Betty Tim Pei. And Bruce, while he was there, started complaining about having a headache. And this is, at this point in time, he's dealing with a lot of headaches left and right. And she gives him essentially an aspirin, right?
Yeah, it was like a prescription aspirin type deal. And I forget what the name of it was.
The name of the pill, I believe, was called Equigescent.
Okay.
Something along those lines. I'm probably murdering the pronunciation. But, he takes the pill and lays down. And not long afterwards, Betty realizes she can't rouse him. She can't wake him up.
This, to me, is tragic because, who's to say? But like Betty freaks out, and I don't know if it's for whatever reason she wasn't super excited about calling attention to the fact that Bruce was at her apartment. I don't know if there was an affair going on or what, but she doesn't for a long time.
She pretty much calls everybody but the police.
She should have called the police or an ambulance or somebody.
Yeah.
But she calls Raymond Chow, and then he comes over, but it takes 90 minutes or something like that.
Hong Kong traffic.
Yeah. So it takes him forever to get over there, and like still Bruce is out, and they can't rouse him. And so finally he gets there, and they call an ambulance. But by the time he's in the hospital, it's too late.
Being out for that period of time, real bad. And like Arif said, she did not call an ambulance right away. And the ambulance, not only did it take Raymond Chow a long time to get there, and he basically gets there and is like, we need to call an ambulance.
Yeah. What are you doing?
And then it takes a while for the ambulance to arrive. So by the time that Bruce actually gets help, it has been an unimaginable amount of time.
Yeah, far too long.
Bruce is taken to the hospital in Hong Kong where, they work on him, feverishly. I mean, they work on him for a while, but they're unable to bring him back.
It was on July 20th, 1973. Bruce was 32 years old. And what's really sad, too, is that, with all the tabloid stuff, it had become a popular headline that, like, Bruce Lee is dead and all this stuff. And it had gotten to the point where his mother didn't even believe it anymore. Like, she didn't even blink an eye. And so when she initially found out that he actually had died, like, she didn't believe it.
Yeah, and we got to remember, this is the 24-hour news cycle, pre-internet. Word traveled, but word did not travel fast.
Yeah.
And it took a long time for that to actually make its way throughout Hong Kong, but also throughout the United States. So, I mean, his buddies back home back in the United States, they'd gotten accustomed to reading or hearing about Bruce Lee passing away, but like it finally became real. I think you would have to like get a newspaper in Chinatown that finally like all of them are saying, Bruce Lee died. So it became real. And I think a lot of his friends, which comes out in Bruce Thomas's account, don't really believe it until Linda contacts him. It's like, no, this time it's actually true.
There's a gigantic memorial for Bruce in Hong Kong where on the street where his casket was before he's buried. And, I think Thomas says something like 30,000 people lined the streets. And eventually, Bruce's body makes its way back to Seattle. And that's where he's buried on July 31st.
But there's a lot of speculation that swirls around Bruce's death. So I think with a lot of the people that we cover in the show, this would be kind of the part where we wrap it up. But there's a lot to kind of talk about wrapped around Bruce's death.
Yeah.
The fact that he died at Betty Ting Pei's apartment is not immediately disclosed. They put together a different story that glides over the fact that Bruce died in another woman's home.
Yeah, and even when that comes out, they try to, say that Betty wasn't there at first, that she found him.
Yeah, and Nerf actually lies at first and says like, Bruce hasn't been to my house in like years.
Yeah, and then like later, and then this is a jump ahead, but later turns around and like
changes her story.
Yeah, completely.
And I mean, in which she had to, because someone went and checked the ambulance records and they were like, well, no, it says that the ambulance went to your house.
Yeah.
So, people found out the truth, and it's unclear why I don't even know if it's unclear, because obviously it's not good to have Bruce Lee at an actress's home, not, with his wife where he dies. So speculation swirls, and anybody who's learned a little bit about Bruce Lee knows that there's all kinds. Everybody has an opinion on who and or what killed Bruce Lee. I mean, I know your days at Kent State.
Yeah. So, and again, like we've alluded to this in the past, like there's people at Kent State, you can, do like a trial run of like Kung Fu or whatever. And me and my freshman roommate were like, we're totally going to do this. So we did it. And the group that runs it was great and they were cool and all that. And then one day, one of the instructors brings up says something about Bruce Lee, and so everyone wants to hear. And she says that, by her account, that Bruce Lee had run afoul of, traditional martial artists in China because, initially for teaching Kung Fu to non-Chinese, but then also regarding his form of martial arts as the greatest and that he was the greatest martial artist on earth. And so they had sent assassins to poison Bruce. And that's not an uncommon thing. Like even in Bruce Thomas's book, he has accounts of some of Bruce's friends and people who knew him who more or less thought stuff along those same lines. And there was speculation about Betty Ting Pei and Raymond Chow conspiring to kill Bruce and just all this stuff. And it's mysterious and it was like painful for a lot of people and it was eaten up by the tabloids. But really, because it was such a huge deal, the government actually ordered like an autopsy and inquiry into his death, and really like
it was pretty exhaustive. It was
and conclusive. You know, before reading this book, it was like in my mind, I thought there was all this mystery around Bruce's death because there had never been like a conclusion, but there was a conclusion.
Yeah, and I think that a big part about it was that Bruce was a really healthy guy. So people just didn't believe that he suddenly up and died.
Yeah.
And, you know, all of this mystery that swirled around his death, it's gone on for quite some time. And part of the thing that's produced from that autopsy is people found out that Bruce had been consuming cannabis. And
it's an important distinction, too, that in Hong Kong at the time, cannabis was really looked down upon. Like today in the States, we're dealing with an opioid epidemic. And
right.
At the time then, it was more acceptable to use opium than it was to use cannabis.
It's basically the flip side of what we're living in right now.
Honestly, it really is.
You know, because opium had been something that had existed in China and it was accepted to a certain degree. And at this point in time, outside of mainland China. But cannabis was foreign. It was like, this is what the hippies use. This is what Westerners bring and like corrupt the youth.
A white devil leaf.
So to find out that Bruce had been consuming weed was not good. And people had, you know, made speculation that somehow that had something to do with how he died. And of course, the medical examiners were like, it really, like, he could have had a cup of tea. Like, it made no difference.
Yeah, like, this is literally irrelevant. And what they said was the official, you know, ruling was that he had died from an acute cerebral edema, and it was due to hypersensitivity to one of the ingredients in that pill that he had gotten from Pei Tempeh.
Yeah.
And really, I know it's a cooler story if this is a mystery and like all this other stuff, but I mean, Occam's razor here, like that's probably what it was.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting to me is the lead up to like the fact that he had passed out before and had this, and it's dealing with the same issue.
Yeah, I mean, again, fluid around the brain.
Unless he was being like steadily poisoned or something like that. But I mean, what it seems to be is just that, you know, there was clearly something wrong and it seems to have been tied to this pill. And the fact that like,
or even not. I mean, I don't know. Obviously I'm not a doctor, but like, it seems to me it would be at least plausible that whatever had caused this to happen maybe could have been, you know, maybe the bigger issue was that he didn't get help right away.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously, look, it's 1973. Some of the kind of diagnosis, you know, maybe they're not diagnosing things as well. Like, obviously, that's a huge part of it. And it could, or, you know, maybe it is or isn't connected to the health issues that he had leading up to this idea.
But it's unclear at that point what caused it.
Right.
That. I mean, you know, there's like the heat and the exhaustion and that sort of stuff. But I mean, my understanding is that you would normally get fluid built up around the brain from like traumatic impact.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, obviously, it's the idea that he just suddenly died from nothing is kind of unfounded.
And again, it's important to note that tabloids took this stuff and ran
with it. So beyond that, they run with the idea he's sleeping around and, you know, this is all connected to how he dies. And one, you know, to really underscore one way that the tabloids ran with stories around Bruce, when he was filming with Game of Death with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, there's a murder basically at one of Jabbar's residences in the United States. And the headline was Bruce Lee connected to mass murder.
Yeah.
And it's like, what?
Yeah, I think like 2 people were killed, which like not to downplay that, but I don't think we would call that a mass
And what
murder.
does this have to do with Bruce?
Yeah, literally nothing.
So he dies actually in, you know, as Arif said, in July of 1973. This is before Enter the Dragon is released. It's before Enter the Dragon was released, and it's before he finishes Game of Death.
But there had been some scenes like the one with Jabbar already filmed.
There was about like 20 minutes of usable footage that had been...
But they used whatever they could.
So in the wake of Bruce's death, I mean, Bruce was the kind of Hong Kong icon. And it's sparked a rash of what I call Bruce-sploitation films. Yeah. So people trying to capitalize on that image that Bruce Lee had. And it's funny because I actually have a collection of films called the Bruce Lee collection. So it's Bruce Lee, but it's like L-E, not L-E-E. Of this guy who just billed himself as being the next Bruce Lee. And he basically just did his best to act and sound like Bruce Lee. And there was a lot of other actors that tried to slide into that role. One of these guys was Jackie Chan.
Yeah, and it's funny because, again, we said this book was published in the 90s, and he talks about this group of people who, like, the next Bruce Lee, in quotations. And it's funny because, like, I wouldn't say he writes Jackie Chan off, but he kind of was like, you know, Jackie Chan is trying to like make it, but it seems like he's, you know, having trouble and that sort of stuff. And obviously any of you who, you know, have ever seen, you know, the Rush Hour movies or the Shanghai noon and night movies, like Jackie Chan definitely made it.
Yeah, Jackie, you know, started out very much so in Bruce's shadow. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is Jackie Chan was in Enter the Dragon.
Yeah.
He was a stunt double. if you guys want to go back and check it out, he's a guy who gets grabbed, kind of has like the hair pull thing, and I can't remember if he like breaks his neck or just throws him. But you get a very good face shot of a young Jackie Chan. But eventually, to Chan's credit, he breaks out of that mold and goes on to make his own kind of style.
What's important about Jackie Chan is, and sort of the difference maker to me, was that, these guys who tried to be Bruce Lee, they kind of just fell to the wayside. But like Jackie Chan's big thing was that he had his own style. And like, yes, obviously he's like standing on the shoulders of Bruce Lee, and that sort of action and fight choreography was popular. But Jackie Chan, his movies and his fight scenes, they all have a very different feel.
Right. Jackie, I mean, these guys are all Hong Kong artists, and he created a style that, whereas I would describe Bruce's style as very serious, and always having this like very heavy undertones of like lessons.
And like very violent.
Yeah. Whereas Jackie, for the longest time, like he didn't use a whole lot of guns, and there wasn't a whole lot of crazy like he wasn't cutting dudes in half.
Yeah, like there's one like Bruce Lee fight scene where he's like saws a man's head in half or something like that.
Yeah, I think in Big Boss.
Yeah, and like Jackie Chan doesn't do that. It's like very slapstick and it's like funny.
Right. There's the comedic elements that are strung into his fight scenes that are very fast paced and very long. These are long, like Bruce's were long, but the number of blows that that Jackie Chan squeezes into a fight scene is crazy, and the comedic elements and the way that he uses the environment is very different from what Bruce did. And like you said, the guys who managed to make it big in the wake of Bruce Lee really kind of moved out of that mold and learned to do their own thing. And it's funny that you mentioned Jackie, because Bruce Thomas is publishing this book in 94, so he probably started writing it earlier. Jackie Chan's big breakout, I'd say, is crossover breakout. He has a movie called like Cannonball Run that's mildly successful, but the really one that puts him on the market in the U.S. was, I think, Rumble in the Bronx, which comes out in 95.
Just in time for Bruce Thomas to be wrong.
Right. So, yeah, there's a rash of Bruceploitation films. And, in that context, his son Brandon is trying to make his way through, find his way in life.
And I mean, it wasn't an easy upbringing for Brandon necessarily. Obviously, he had grown up comfortable, like in terms of financials, but you grow up in a shadow that large, it would have been tough. And like Melvin said, he was trying to kind of make his own name in Hollywood, doing similar films.
Imagine all the guys who were trying to fight you as a kid growing up. And, Brandon, unfortunately, and this goes back to the lore of Bruce Lee.
And being cursed.
Yeah, he ends up dying while filming The Crow in March of 1993. It's crazy to think about. He gets shot by a blank, really, while filming.
Yeah, and it was interesting for me to read Thomas's account, because I had always heard that he had been shot by a real bullet and it had killed him, like that someone had like not put the right bullets in, but it actually was a blank. It was like that the blank had been used for a previous scene that like you needed to see a round go into the gun, and then whenever they fired like a different blank, it propelled the fake bullet fast enough to like pierce Brandon and kill him.
And it was so shocking because the way obviously he's been actually shot, and they were like, wow, what a scene.
They're like, wow, that is great acting.
Right. And he's like, no, I'm dying. Idiots, help me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's tragic to think about. And, one of the other sad things is we were talking about these Bruceploitation films. And, he'd filmed part of Game of Death. And, they decide we're going to finish Game of Death with, obviously, post-Bruce. And they do so with a bunch of stand-ins, some pre-recorded footage.
Some cardboard
cutouts. It's really a...
disrespectful.
It's an affront to kind of the efforts that Bruce put into his films. And, Game of Death comes out, it's bad. And they re-release like episodes of the Green Hornet that had been mashed together in a weird way. So, everybody's trying to
get their money,
get that little bit of Bruce that's left. But the film Enter the Dragon, it becomes an international hit. I think in Hong Kong, obviously it's a hit, but it's not necessarily bigger than his previous films. I think it grosses about the same as the film that he had before. But the film is huge in the United States, and it's probably even bigger in Japan, where the earlier films they didn't necessarily send over there right away because obviously it played on a lot of that anti-Japanese sentiment, so they just didn't think it would play well. But to everybody, to people's shock a little bit, Enter the Dragon was a huge hit globally.
Yeah, and I feel like also part of the reason it wasn't as huge in China as it was in the United States was that it was kind of made more in the Western like feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was. And So, we talked about before, Bruce had been playing these roles as kind of the Chinese country bumpkin or the lower level, like entry level worker.
Yeah, now he's James Bond.
Right. And, that worked in the West, but it didn't necessarily work as well in Hong Kong. So one of the interesting places that Bruce had found himself in life was as he's trying to straddle these two worlds, to a certain degree, he finally made it in Hong Kong. Like he couldn't get in through the front door, so he had to kick down the side door and get in. And
put hinges in hands.
Right. And he was kind of marked for being too foreign in the U.S., but then at the same time, in certain aspects, like in Hong Kong, they were like marking like, yeah, but he's like too westernized.
Yeah.
So it's like he found himself in this weird place, but he managed to find success.
And the legacy he left is, we don't need to spend a ton of time because I feel like it speaks for itself. Good luck finding almost any aspect of pop culture that Bruce Lee hadn't touched. Like, I mean, right now we're recording this in 2018 and like Avengers Infinity Wars just came out. And like Stan Lee has been on the record saying that Bruce Lee was like the original superhero. And like his inspiration he was Stan Lee's inspiration for numerous superheroes, any of these video games.
Oh, dude.
Yeah. Tekken.
Law.
Exactly. And what's his name from Mortal Kombat?
Oh, Kung Lao. Oh, yeah. Liu Kang.
Liu Kang is Bruce Lee. You know what I mean? Like, and all over the place. And,
he's everywhere.
Yeah. And Melvin had mentioned, in the Boondocks, you had,
Yeah, the characters that, had borrowed from characters that had been written into Bruce Lee's films. And I always said growing up, and this is one thing that I've, explored, was just that, like, there's this certain cultural connection that African Americans had towards Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
Because in the, at that point in time, there wasn't a whole lot of like action stars that weren't white.
Yeah.
And, I talked to my dad about it, and, they talk about how, like, man, seeing this dude who wasn't, a white guy and who was kind of a minority, but still out there, like, taking names and kicking, what?
Yeah.
Like, it was huge. And that, if you look at the Boondocks, like, that legacy of kind of resonating with the African American community is still there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, Dana White, he's on the record for saying, like, we have MMA and, the UFC because of Bruce Lee.
Absolutely.
And he's not wrong. Like, this is the guy who pioneered, we're not going to say he was the first person to ever mix arts. Like, it wasn't common, but I'm sure someone did it. But he pioneered that mindset of saying, like, let's take what's useful and discard what's not. And it doesn't matter if it's karate, judo, jujitsu, whatever. We just want to be the most complete fighter that we can be, whether it's standing or on the ground or wherever. Just be ready. So his impact was absolutely enormous. And in terms of kind of looking at him as a human, he was a great guy, but he also had his demons. He would help out a friend in need. If you needed money, like there was one friend, I can't remember who it was, but he was like dying of cancer.
Yeah.
And he would just like turn to Linda and be like, yo, send him $500.
Yeah, or send him however much. And yeah, he definitely took care of his friends. And, as we've learned on this podcast that, people have their flaws. And in my mind, on balance, Bruce Lee had fewer flaws than he had great things about him. And obviously, I mean, you don't need us to tell you that history has remembered Bruce Lee kindly and in my mind, appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we weigh him against some of the other people that we, cover in the podcast, he comes out smelling pretty good.
Oh, yeah, I definitely feel good about Bruce Lee.
But, yeah, I mean, but a violent temper. The fact that he just goes off and breaks one of his students' jaws, pretty wild.
Well, he shouldn't have hit him.
Yeah, it's like when you play in the schoolyard with your brothers and stuff, and it's like, the kid, like, you accidentally hit him. It's like, oh, now you're really in for it.
Yeah.
But, dealing with the legacy, obviously there's the people who see him as the untouchable warrior that never lost.
LeVar Lee.
And you have the people who are like, yo, he was trash. He was just an actor. And I think the reality is, Bruce falls somewhere in between that. I think the guys that completely dismiss him and say like, well, he never fought in the ring, so how we know how good he is? And it's like, that's not what he was about. He grew up, fighting on the streets. And the way that he trained was not to fight in the ring. It was, to fight.
He wouldn't have been allowed to fight in most rings.
Right. And that's not to say that he would beat any man on the planet, because I think anybody who's ever taken part in any sort of martial arts or sports competition, you can't beat everybody all the time, but you can train hard and be ready, as ready as you can. And, when you square up with somebody, anything can happen. You don't need us to tell you that. So, I mean, I think, to disrespect the legacy that he has as a martial artist and as opening the doors and creating all of this innovation, you can't overlook that.
Yeah.
But like we always say, at the end of the day, he's just a person. So, is that it? Have we wrapped it up?
Yeah, man, that is it. Thank you all very much for sticking in there with us, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you very much. Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X Podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. If you go through our Amazon portal, any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support. Thank you.